Mixing with Mike mixing tip, parallel processing for mix stems. This is a thing that came up recently in a mix session, and I was talking with one of my students about how to pull together a mix quickly. And in their particular situation, one of the things that they come across, which a lot of people come across, is that perhaps the budget is really low. So they don't really have the time necessarily to dig into all of the finer components of the song. They need to kind of really get good basic sounds, pull it all together pretty quickly, and give them something that is, is representative of a more finished mix. And so for this type of process, and the way I'm going to describe it here, it's not necessarily something that you would go to as, too early on in a mix. So like if you're doing a more sophisticated mix, this is a great process that helps to add density, focus, and clarity to all the things that you're doing. But if you kind of use it as a crutch, and when I say a crutch, meaning that your mix isn't quite right, so you're sort of limping around with your mix, and then you kind of pull this in to kind of get you so that you can go a little faster or make the mix kind of come together a little bit better, you're not really solving the problem. So in that case, it could be a crutch. But just to kind of show you this technique, because I think it's really cool, it all stems from my own, a process that's not my own. It's not like something like I invented it, but what I call the 3-tier mix structure. And what I have is I have a series of tracks. Like, for example, here, these red tracks are vocal tracks, and the effects tracks that follow up right next to them are all bussed into bus 9 and 10, and that comes into a stem track, which is here in the darker blue. These darker blue tracks then feed into the mix bus where I can do processing. So what this does is it gives me the ability to process tracks on an individual basis, process tracks on a stem level. So once I have it with effects, I can then compress it all together or EQ it as a global thing, apply analog tape processing, loads of things that you can do to just sort of mix enhancement type of stuff. I'm usually very subtle with it on that level. And then it feeds into the mix bus. And the mix bus is a way of kind of pulling the whole thing together. So the 3-tier structure is individual tracks, audio tracks with their effects. In this case, we have bass out to buses 1 and 2 with its effects going into bus 1 and 2. We have all the drums and percussion into 3 and 4. With their effects going into 3 and 4, keyboards 5 and 6 with their effects going into 5 and 6. Very well organized. Like every level of this is very carefully organized and crafted. So if I mute any of these things and I still hear some stray tracks, then I know maybe one of my effects returns is now feeding into the mix bus directly. So, these are the ways of checking on that. The idea of pulling in the parallel processing without doing a whole big setup, and it's really quick, is that I'll just take the bass track, and what I'll do is the stem, and I'll duplicate it. And when I duplicate it, which I've already done here, I rename it. I'm just going to call it a bass parallel. So when setting up a parallel track, what most people do, and there are variations of this, where you can do it on an individual track. So for example, here with some of the vocal tracks that I have on this, I created what I call a vocal squash track, where I wanted to process a little bit of an overdrive into the vocal, and I put it into a parallel chain. But this is also feeding into that same track. Okay, so in this particular case, I may have a somewhat of a separated squash for a snare or a kick or something like that I want to mix in. This is different. This is only on the stem level, not on the individual level. And the idea here is that I want to kind of duplicate the settings more or less just the way that I have the original track. So in other words, if I set up, for example, a V-comp on one of these parallel chains, I put the identical thing on each one. If I use a max volume, I do the identical setup on each one. If I do a CL76, I do the identical setup on each one. So why would I do that? The reason is that I've already spent some time and energy balancing out my levels, kind of pulling things together. So this is not designed to be like, oh, let's really super hype up the drum sound. What this is, it's a way of kind of pulling into focus and your overall mix. So what I want to do is I want to play a little bit of what I have without. So this is just going to be the mix without any parallel processing. So we can hear, we'll hear a little bit of it here. I'll just cue right up to sort of where the keyboard section. So now with each of these parallels, what I've done here, just to kind of simplify, and I'll show you the settings, so I'm not going to hide anything here. What I'll do is I'm just going to select my tracks here, and this will give me some shortcut ability to kind of bypass things. I'm going to bypass this, a little bit of Pro Q2 here, but nothing that complicated. So here what I'm going to show you is, we'll start with the V-comp. What the V-comp is really good at is adding like warmth and body into something, or fullness into something. When I set this up, I want a really heavy amount of compression. I want a fairly high ratio, 4:1 or 6:1, and generally I want to use an auto release. Part of this is a mechanical disposition of the original hardware, which is if you set it to 400, the recovery will be faster, and then because the attack is around 5 milliseconds, the recovery will be too fast if there's a break section, and then you may get some kind of click or a little push from it that you don't necessarily want, and you don't want to be programming it to not do that afterwards. So what I've done here is I kind of set it up, and I also like this. It gives it an initial quick release with a little bit of a pump, and then a very slow, long release characteristic, which helps to kind of pull in the sustain and the overall power. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this in, and the way that I do it is once I've set it up, so I'll go track by track, and I'll make sure that each stem is getting that very similar amount of gain reduction. Okay, so each one of these. So I will have to, although I'll set up a basic setting here, I'll keep it and I'll duplicate those settings, but I'll also try to get the same amount of gain reduction per each track. And so now what we do is let's start to mix again, and I'll start to mix this in, and I want you to notice how it'll get a little louder, of course, but notice like the feeling and the focus of the individual sounds. So now this is 15 dB lower than the original, and I set these up so that they're passing through at unity gain. So this is not, it's not as if this is adding in an additional 10 dB a gain on the output. Very important. You want to make sure that each one, when you set it up, that is passing unity gain, because the idea of this is not to change mix balances, is try to focus them in. And I think you can really hear when that comes in how that fills it out. Now there are a couple of ways to kind of get into doing this. One is to setting up with the max volume. This is a really great one, or an MV2. I like the max volume because it has one additional feature, which the MV2 has a few, but one in particular is the loud soft button. So with the loud, it's going to give a little bit more pump. The cool part about this one is that it's sort of a top-down, bottom-up compressor or limiter. So you're bringing out low-level compression that compresses low-level signals, pulls them up so you get more focus. And then you can also compress high-level signals. Again, important to bring that gain reduction down. You see a little chatter right here. If you wanted to, you could even, kind of squash that a little bit with a gate that's on the bottom. You could see that down here. And so what this sounds like is different than the V-comp. So. So what you'll notice here is that this is much more transparent in terms of it's not adding a real tonal character, where the V-comp is distinctly adding sort of a warmth to the character of it. So you might select the V comp over it if you were looking to kind of, bring in a little more vintage warmth into it. You do this if you basically like your mix and you want to or you have plenty of what you want in terms of vintage warmth in the sound, and you want to do something that's a little more transparent that makes it solid, then this is a great option. Another one, and this is a little bit more of a rock and roll one, but it also has a tonal character, is the 1176. This is the Waves version of it. I particularly like the Silverface. The Blackface one is a bit warmer sounding. The Silverface one is got a bit more of an open, edgy kind of character, which I kind of like. Sometimes in these parallel chains, you can also run a distortion plugin. And by running a saturation plugin of some kind, then what you're getting in this is like a little bit of an edginess. So with this, you can kind of mix in globally kind of a little bit more oomph all the way around and a little bit more edginess if you feel like maybe the mix is a little bit boring or lacks a little zip to it. This is really cool with an all setting and a fast release. So this is a very fast release. I think it's 50 milliseconds is what it amounts to on this. The attack is always less than a millisecond, but I have it down to 3. So this is on the slower side. The fast is up at 7. So this is the fastest release. The slowest release is at 1. So let's check this out. So this is also a very, very different tone, bit more open, bit more aggressive, more movement. So it can add more excitement to a mix that maybe needs a little bit of that. Okay, so there, you could feel like a little bit more depth, a little bit more movement, and that has to do with, the movement here, that pumping and breathing type of effect in the background. So especially the important part of this is that you're feeding all of the reverbs and all of that into this. So what happens is if in the kick channel, or in the drum and percussion channel, you have the kick drum kind of really driving that. Now when you're feeding the reverb in on top of it, it's also pumping that reverb, and it really helps to achieve this effect. If you really notice, what it'll do is it'll kind of make the kick drum sound like it's driving the track more, without adding any more volume to it, because it's really pumping and breathing and moving everything within that parallel compression channel. And so that's an important part of creating that kind of sound. So let's go through them one by one. One of the things that I did here was just a little, like a very minor touch-up EQ. Like sometimes when you do this, you may find that it brings out certain aspects like a harshness. If you use the analog components, you generally don't get that type of thing. But maybe a little bit of low-mid, a little bit too much low-mid stuff going on. So you can kind of go in and run some things here on some of the channels. You notice that the stuff that I put on here is very subtle, a little bit of a lift on the top end. Right now this is bypassed, and just to kind of show you an example of some of the things. So this was the vocal track. This was an effects track, sound effects, not reverb type of things. This is keyboards. This is the drums, where I'm kind of dipping a little bit in the 200 to kind of open that up a little bit, and then leaving the bass kind of flat with a little bit more rolled off on the top end. Subtle things that can kind of create a little bit of separation. But let's go back to the V comp, and now what I'm going to do in this round is to go through so you can hear V comp. So I'll set this up here. I'll get rid of these guys right here. I'll also set up a max volume. Maybe what I'll do is I'll do it from the drums, because this is where you'll see the most activity. And then this guy. And this way, as you're watching this, you'll be able to see the activity from each of them and which one is on, and see what's kind of going on. All right, here we go. So I think you'll hear like a subtle difference between each of them, and I'm not exaggerating them. And I want them purposely to be like the same volume, so one isn't particularly louder. So if you really notice, there's a warmth that's added with the V comp. There is a clarity or a more transparent nature that solidifies the sound with the max volume, and then there's a little bit more edge and in movement with the CL76. This is definitely much more of a rock and roll kind of thing. But and so probably for this style, I might go with the V comp and then kind of with a subtle tweak on the EQ just to kind of enhance that a little bit. But very cool way of quickly kind of shaping or pulling together a mix and doing it in a very consistent, productive way. I think one of the problems with stems and dealing with stems is that people have a tendency to do completely independent processing on all of the stems, and then you lose a cohesiveness in the rest of the mix. And this is kind of a cool way to give you the solidity and imaging that you're looking for in a mix, and do it in quick fashion. So 3-tier mix structure is a must. Set up your parallel chains, set up the processor of choice, and have some fun. Finish a mix, make it quick. All right, there you have it. There's a mix tip of the week, parallel processing for mix stems.